Good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Ruzbe Parsi. I'm head of the Middle East and North Africa program here at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. I will be moderating this webinar, which is organized in cooperation with the Global Politics and Security program. And it is a kind of a continuation of a thread that we've been pursuing in several previous webinars, which is about religion and how it is conceptualized in international politics. In this installment, as it were, we're going to discuss more in detail the connections between non-state actors in forms of various movements and how they affect both the relationship between states, but affect also domestic politics in those states. So our conversation today is about transnational Islamism and the relations it has with France and the UAE and the relations between France and the UAE. And in order to do this, we have a very interesting and excellent panel, which consists of experts on various fields, and it will be my exquisite honor and challenge to try and connect the dots between all the various pieces of the puzzle. With us, we have Ms. Reem Sarah Alouane, who is a French legal scholar and law PhD candidate at Toulouse Capitole University in France. She's researching religious freedom, human rights, and civil liberties in Europe and North America. We also have Dr. Lucia Ardovini, who is a postdoc researcher here at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, an expert on trajectories, current trajectories of Islamist movements across the MENA region, and in our case, particularly also, of course, North Africa to the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, where some of these things are also happening. Last but not least, Mr. Mohammed Baharoun, who is the Director General of Buhut, sorry for the pronunciation, the Dubai Public Policy Research Center. His area of expertise is geostrategy, reputation and soft power, public policy and international relations. My hope is that by being able to discuss this very, very complicated issue from various angles, we will all come out of this somewhat wiser as to what it means, what it is and what it is not. So in order to do that, we first also need to kind of come to grips with the phenomenon. What is it? Because the word and the concept of Islamism is something that is used both by those who adhere to it, but it is also used as a description and as an accusation. So therefore, it would be interesting to first, and here I'm turning to you, Lucia, to help us get a kind of a basic definition, at least, not a perfect one, but a basic definition of what is Islamism and what is Islamism as a transnational movement. Please.
Yes, thank you. That is not a small task, but before we begin, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me here. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to go straight into it. And today I will begin by giving a quick overview of Islamism, what is meant by it, and how it has come to be such a transnational, controversial topic of discussion in both domestic, regional, and foreign policy. So political Islam or Islamism is a term that refers to any interpretation of Islam as a source of political identity and action. So this means that Islamism is obviously not a monolithic phenomenon or a monolithic force, but rather it encompasses, a wide range of movements, ideological positions, and individuals whose characteristics are largely dependent on the various national contexts that they develop in. So generally speaking, when we talk about Islamism, we are referring to the use of Islam as a source of concepts and metaphors for articulating political positions. What this means in practice is that when looking at the MENA region and beyond, Islamism has played a historical, very considerable role in processes of state building and in the shaping of political identities, and is therefore deeply embedded into the social and political fabrics of several of these countries, both in the MENA and beyond, which is also where the transnational element comes in, because by directly influencing, politics and society, it will also, and it has historically had an effect on relationship with other regional and global powers. Just to give you a very quick example of how different the manifestation of Islamism can be, we can refer, for example, to North Africa and to the case of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which since its founding in 1928 adopted, a very strong anti-colonial message, a very crucial civil society role, and therefore grew to be one of the main opposition actors in the country and went on to be repressed because of this for most of its history. On the other hand, if we look at Islamism in the Gulf, and particularly in Saudi Arabia, we see that this has played a very different role historically, where in Saudi Arabia, for example, Wahhabism was integrated into state institutions from the very beginning of the kingdom, and is indeed central to the legitimacy and the rule of the House al Saud up until this day. Once again, we see that Islamism goes very much beyond just the national context that it develops in, but therefore affects geopolitics and international relations of all kind. What I'm getting at here, which I think it's a very crucial point, is that in its various forms and manifestation, Islamism has played a very crucial role in the politics and society of various states, therefore also shaping, the relationship with other global and regional actors. And this is where we need to draw a very clear line between Islamism and how it was approached before and after the 2011 uprisings. Before the uprisings, most Islamist groups, most Islamist movements were somewhat tolerated, and they were kind of integrated to different degrees, I guess, into the political systems of the countries that they belonged to, mostly playing the role of opposition actors and driving civil society activities. This became evident when the uprisings came about, and something else that became very clear is that because of these activities, a lot of these movements very often held just as much legitimacy of established regimes, if not more, in certain cases, which led to instances such as Tunisia or Egypt, where Islamists were actually able to come to power through the ballot box, which is kind of where the global attitudes towards the phenomenon started to shift significantly. The fact that the Brotherhood or Ennahda were elected into power generated panic both regionally and internationally, with many fearing what was dubbed as the Islamist takeover, that many feared would spill over into Europe, or states in the Gulf fearing that their legitimacy was going to be challenged. This led to the context in which we find ourselves in today, which is one where Islamist movements are now as repressed as ever. The Brotherhood, for example, is being proscribed by a terrorist organization. The UAE is essentially leading what is a global crusade against Islamism, specifically in the aftermath of 2011, which is mostly due to states in the Gulf being long suspicious of just how much legitimacy Islamist movements can hold both domestically and internationally, and therefore perceiving them as an existential threat. What is quite significant, and I'm really glad that Mohammed is here because he can talk about this more, is the role of the UAE and the role that the UAE is playing in fighting Islamism locally, regionally, and globally. Very much using its economic and geopolitical ties to spread such an approach to its ally in the West. So just to wrap it up, and once again going back to the transnational nature of the phenomenon, what we're seeing today is that this approach that is being championed by states in the Gulf is gaining traction in Europe, and specifically in France, where Macron is also aligned with the UAE in other diplomatic efforts, if so we want to call them, in the region. What this signals is that there is a growing preoccupation in Europe over what are both old and new diasporic communities, but also the key problem here is legitimacy and the preservation of the status quo. This is evident in the fact that most of the existing research that has been done on Islamist communities and on Islamism in general in the West has since 9/11, I would say, been driven mostly by a focus on violent jihadism and radicalization, and by the fact that to this day, as we're discussing today, Islamist presence in the West has often been utilized in public discourses to support populist and right-wing ideologies. But I think I'm gonna stop here. There is a lot to talk about, but I'm gonna leave the floor to the other speakers.
Thank you. So just to kind of comprise this a bit, what we're talking about is a phenomenon that has played very, very different roles in different contexts. On the one hand, it can be opposition. In other cases, it has actually helped legitimize the state.
Exactly.
And this plays out differently because of the national context, but also because it travels. So even though it looks like one thing in one place, when it travels, it can turn into something else elsewhere. The next issue, of course, and this is something we're going to come back to when we bring Reem into the conversation, is what is legitimacy and how is it challenged? And this is not an issue that can be confined to monarchies or authoritarian states, but this is also something that is now happening in Europe, which has to do with how populism is developing here. So it means, can people be integrated using the same tools for political mobilization, or do they need to go through any particular kind of vetting before that is acceptable, so to speak? And so that, in a sense, has as much to do with how democracy has been weakened or delegitimized as it has to do with whether these groups in particular are strong or not. And they run the gamut from those who want to use violence, who those to at least claim and ostensibly do not use violence. Just to kind of show how complex the whole thing is. Thank you, Lucia. Now, Mohammed, turning to you, and Lucia was kind of giving us the segue there, so to speak, is what is the view in the UAE, if you can convey that to us, but also what is your own assessment of Islamism, which we, of course, we don't have to go through the whole catalog of all the countries and all the variations of it, but the ones that are in particular interest or relevance to the UAE, and how much of this is foreign policy, and to what extent does it have domestic dimensions as well in the case of the UAE? Please.
Thank you very much. I think it's an excellent way of starting on definition of Islamism, but also we need to differentiate between Islamism and Islam. So Islam, for instance, in the case of the UAE, is, according to Article 7 in the UAE Constitution, it's the religion of the state. So the majority of people in the UAE are Muslims. But even though this, the constitution, stipulates that Islam is the state, is the religion of the state, it also allows freedom of belief across. And I think that is where the difference comes with Islamism, because Islamism is not only political Islam; it's a belief superiority. So people who believe that there's an acute prejudice towards one religion against others, that it is the only one way of looking at things and everything around it is wrong. And I think that where the first element of let's say, risk connected with Islamism is there, is obvious. And that is what you see in movements like takfirism. Those people who don't follow even Islam in a specific way becomes kafir and then are subject to be eliminated, so to speak. So it's that type of belief superiority that becomes the first element of risk when assessing Islamism rather than assessing Islam. And we've seen this in groups like ISIS, who reportedly killed people because they made mistakes in reciting Quran. And that takes you to sort of an identity conflict. And it's a macro identity, not a micro identity. It's not a national identity. It's a much larger thing that transcends national borders and goes beyond everyone. The second point is the concept of sovereignty, which is attached to transnationalism, because things that travel outside, that transcends borders, have no respects to sovereign laws in a specific way. So the transnational aspect of Islamism, which is also sometimes associated with a supranational aspect of Islamism. For instance, Khamenei is above Rouhani. He is something above the national level. He's a supranational entity. Same thing can be said about Badi', for instance, and the way he treated Morsi, who was the president of Egypt, but Badi' was above him. So these two elements affect the sovereignty of the state. Now that takes us to the idea of the state itself. Now, transnationalism, transnational identity of a specific religion becomes, when it becomes going across borders, it affects the concept of the nation state, which is the building block of the whole world order. And that is a threat or a risk to the whole global governance system. The UN membership is on state level, on nation state, not on non-state actors. And that is where the assessment of the risk. Now, how did that affect UAE policy, both on either domestic or foreign? Now, domestically, the UAE have looked at concepts like national identity and instated what does a national identity look like? What does it mean to people who are living in the UAE, not necessarily just of the UAE, but also included that the concept of diversity. And the UAE, being a federation made out of 7 emirates, had diversity as part of its political system. But it looks at diversity in demographics and ethnicity. And for instance, you'll find in the UAE a celebration that the UAE houses something like over 200 nationalities. That becomes part of how we look at diversity. And that diversity is based on a value-based politics. So the respect of other religions, the respect of freedom of religion, concept of tolerance, concept of happiness, even concepts of empowerment of youth, of others. So that's on the domestic level. On the foreign policy, I mean, I would differ with the concept that the UAE led a crusade against Islamism. The UAE did not approve of non-state actors who are trying to, get into its own land or affect its own policies. But it has always supported state institutions across the board. It did not support non-state institutions. And it has also created what Gargash calls axis of moderation. Moderation is the opposite of extremism. And I've also looked at things like the Declaration of Human Fraternity, all the way up to Abrahamic Accords. These are foreign policies that are glued or built inside the concept of tolerance and respect to other religions. And of course, downsides the concept of the superiority of a certain belief. And I think that is the guiding principles where the UAE was operating and how both foreign and domestic policies intertwine.
Thank you. I mean, there is a lot to unpack here, and I'm glad that you brought in sovereignty, because that was where we started in our first installment, in our first webinar on this issue. One could, of course, historically say that it used to be the other way around. That is, that the religions are by definition transnational because the nation state is a rather new phenomenon compared to the age of religions, and that in most religions, the connections always exist beyond the borders of states. That goes even for most churches. I mean, the Catholic Church being the obvious one. That goes for, as you mentioned yourself, I mean, the Supreme Leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, is also a religious role model for people who don't live in Iran and are not even Iranian. So that element in itself has always been there. So you could, in a sense, look at it from the different perspective of saying what happened with the nation state and what happened with the modern international order that we have is that these things that used to be a normal phenomenon, not in a normative sense necessarily, but as in it was nothing out of the ordinary, are now considered to be exceptional. And that religion, in a sense, is supposed to be confined within the borders of a state. Now, for that to work, of course, what you're dealing with is the institutions of religion, because Christianity, just like Islam, doesn't know any borders as a religion, but its institutions can be national. And so what happens with these transnational movements is that they don't want to play according to those rules. They want to be able, in a sense, to be both institutionally and ideologically beyond and above, if you will, the control of states, any state. But at the same time, the reason why they are considered to be a threat in some countries, or at least perceived as such, is that they do want to play local and national politics. And so that connection, of course, then becomes problematic for states who are very keen on their sovereignty. That is, you are fielding candidates in a specific election in a specific country, based on an ideology that you can share with people who live in another country. And that could, of course, be, you can define that as a problem, or you can think of that as, again, nothing out of the ordinary. That depends on the assessment of whether the ideology that they share is problematic or not. And if I understand you correctly, the way you define Islamism, or let's say one of the defining elements of it, is its idea of itself as being superior to other religions, and in the kind of the jihadist takfiri style, also superior to every other interpretation of Islam. This is something that we need to unpack further, because obviously there are very many different kinds of cases here. But thank you for that. And now let me try and segue into the conversation with Reem. France and UAE are very different countries in many, many ways, obviously with very different kinds of histories and contexts. They have certain things in common, if you will, and some of those things are not a question of ideology, they're a question of geopolitics. So for instance, UAE and France have found themselves on the same side, as it were, in their understanding of what they consider to be a very problematic behavior of Turkey. Because Turkey, on the other hand, has been seen as a champion of the Muslim Brotherhood, and also been a champion of the Morsi government when it was in power in Egypt. And then there is, of course, Libya, where everyone is kind of arguing with each other about what's supposed to happen with Libya. Now, in the French case, we have this whole soup, if you will, of what is Islamism? Is it transnational? Is it dangerous? Is it an ideology? Is it an institution? And more importantly, perhaps, to what extent is it becoming a force in French domestic politics more than anything else? And this is where the chameleon concept of islamo-gauchisme comes up, Islamoleftism, which I hope you will help us unpack. We can start just with the fact that, of course, the person who invented it back in, I think it was 2002, did not necessarily intend it to have all the meanings it has today. Like any kind of art of work, it is no longer in the hands of the creator to decide how it is going to be used. It started as an idea of trying to see what that person thought was a connection between hardcore leftists with anti-Semitic traits and Islamists who would go in the same direction. Since then, it has become many, many more things, depending on who you talk to. And of course, the primary question is, does it even exist? Now, Reem, let's take two things here. One, what is your take on what Islamoleftism is and to what extent it exists? And why is it such a hot topic in France, both from a legal perspective, but also because of the politics as it is being playing out in France at the moment?
Thank you. What is Islamoleftism? So first of all, a warning, I do law. So I'm not a political scientist. My field is really law, and meaning I'm quite obsessed with definition, because one word can mean a lot of things, and that's fine. We're here for the discussion. But when we start adopting legislation, it becomes problematic, because one word can affect policy eventually and affect the people who are targeted by this policy. So to understand the concept of Islamoleftism, I need to put some context first here and try to explain what the whole thing is about. What is Islamoleftism? That's a good question. And we don't have a definition on Islamoleftism. So first of all, you need to understand the context of university, because that's where it was, I mean, that's academia that was attacked first. Why? A couple of reasons. So the French Minister of Higher Education, Frédéric Vidal, a couple of months ago announced during an interview that she intends to set up an inquiry to fight so-called Islamoleftism in academia, and also basically targeting academics who worked on discriminations, intersectionality, post-colonial studies, and so on. And my first reaction was, as someone who is in academia, was really fear at first, because it reminds me of the attacks in the 30s, not exactly a glorious time for Europe and the world, against the so-called Judeo-Masonic lobby, which ended with the cleansing of university under the Vichy regime that was established in the 40s. So after her TV announcement, so Frédérique Vidal, the Minister of Higher Education, basically started to say that the CNRS, so one of the leading academia institutions, would conduct a study without really asking them for their opinion. And that's how it started. So many leading institutions, including the CNRS, called out the minister. The conference of the president, the organization of the president of French University also called her out. And even Emmanuel Macron tried to, articulated his disapproval, even though he didn't say anything when, way before Frédérique Vidal, our interior minister, as well, and especially our national education minister, declared that academia was infected by so-called Islamo-leftism. So it's not a new thing. It's just more loud now. So mainly who are attacking group of people, and especially minorities, who called out the state on discrimination, police brutality, police violence, and also who tried to work on the effect of colonization in today's world, in today's policies. And this is perceived as a threat for the state. And it's quite dangerous because the origin of Islamoleftism is quite interesting. The concept, if we can call about the concept, because I don't want to give it more power than it has, is actually very cryptic, very weird and mysterious. So let's try to understand exactly who is targeting here. So the concept was first coined by French philosopher Pierre Tagiev to designate, to talk about this alliance between the far left and especially the Marxist and Islamist, both in the UK and in France. And Tagiev saw this interconnection in an essay written by Chris Herman, who is like a left-wing historian / author in the UK, who argues that the traditionalist leftist movement should ally, should find connection with radical Islam, quote unquote, to overturn capitalism, to fight imperialism, and so on. And the thing is, this concept was completely distorted by French conservative as well as the far right, and also a part of the hardliner secular left to basically target and attack progressive movements who work on the issues I mentioned previously. And the very interesting, scary thing, if I might say, is that every time someone called out a policy, for example, that they deem discriminatory, or a law that they deem might affect minorities even more, automatically this group of people will be accused of siding with terrorism or of being part of the Muslim Brotherhood, right? Even though there is no connection, there is no proof, those are just researchers, sociologists, lawyers, I don't know, even activists, immediately becomes an accusation to shut voices down. And this is when this concept, it's very interesting because nobody in France heard about Islamoleftism until it was on the media and pundits. And of course, everybody is an expert on everything today on TV. The next day, there was a poll. And of course, we won't discuss the methodology here. And all of a sudden, half of France is against Islamoleftism. Even though if you ask anyone in this country, nobody knows what it is. And that's the problem, because it's more playing with the fear that has been nurtured across the years, across the political spectrum in France, by the right wing, by the left, and of course by the far right, that Islam is a religion that needs to be tamed. Islam and Muslims are incapable of integrating within French society, within European society, even though these people are born and raised here, that's the only country they know, right? And that they need to be domesticated. And so Islamoleftism, as used today, is flavored with a touch of anti-Muslim hatred, if I may say, but also a touch of anti-Americanism, because if you hear Jean-Michel Blanquer accusing American campuses of importing intersectionality, critical race theory, post-colonial studies, by the way, who are not even from America, but from South America. So he doesn't even know what he's talking about, really, into France. And so there is also this anti-USA sentiment, because now most voices that cannot be heard here in France cross the Atlantic to be able to be heard. So now we cannot keep our dirty laundry anymore. It crossed oceans and continents. And my point being, now we are using terms like this, Islamoleftism, or even something like political Islam. Again, I'm a lawyer. I want definition that means something in law. Political Islam is a very fuzzy concept for me. What does it mean? Does being a very conservative Muslims make you automatically a terrorist, right? In this country, for example, the mere idea of wearing a hijab, for example, I'm not even talking about the niqab or the burqa or whatever, a hijab, so just a headscarf, right? Is also considered a sign of wanting to implement political Islam in France, and defending the right for women to freely choose to wear a headscarf is considered as Islamoleftism. And the problem we have in France is that everything we've seen as different is perceived as a threat to the unity of the country. And even worse, the fact that the bigger picture here is really about the question of the visibility of religion, today Islam, and as seen through the years, through the legislation that has been passed since the 90s and accelerated since the 2000s. And the regulation of religion, except that today, and I'm sure we will have time to talk about it later during the conversation, we are restricting more civil liberties on the grounds that I previously mentioned. And today in France, the principle becomes the prohibition and liberty the exceptions. On the ground of order or public order, on the ground on the fight of terrorism, etc. Except that all the laws we are currently passing that mainly target Muslims, really, even if the law is aimed to apply to everyone, will not solve terrorism. It's those bills, this law on separatism, for example, that again, we would talk a bit later, is not a counterterrorism law. It's a law reshaping the relation between state and religion to control even more religion, and especially Islam. So I think we need to be careful with words and the impact, especially on civil liberties, because I think we are crossing a line and a point of no return, and it's going to be hard to recover from this.
Thank you. I mean, here, of course, as you mentioned, I mean, we're basically talking also about self-perception, the perception that a governing elite in every country has of what the country is about. And in the French case, it's about Republican values, which President Macron and others feel are threatened by these various, well, let's call them ideas rather than groups, since they're not, it's not a movement in that kind of organizational sense. And it kind of questions the official history of France. We don't even have to get into Algeria to try and understand that there are things here in the French case which have not been dealt with in any systematic fashion. Now, now we have all the pieces of the puzzle. Let's see what kind of pictures we can make out from these pieces. They will not all conform to the same image, and that's not really the aim either. But Lucia, for instance, I mean, here what we're talking about, and Reem, you've mentioned this, and we will get back to that again. In the French case, it's about laïcité. It's also about the way that the French state conceives how religion can be allowed, in what sense and in what way. And so, to put it simply, in the French case, it's freedom from religion, while the American example, if you will, is freedom of religion. So in a sense, it's about you can have your religion and you can proselytize and you can do everything you want in the public sphere in the American case. And in the French case, it's about helping people not having to be confronted with religion in the public sphere. And the state is supposed to be blind to religion. In the same way that in the French case, it's also supposed to be blind to race, which is why it is difficult to even figure out what racism looks like, since the state refuses to collect material or statistics on these issues. Now, Lucia, Mohammed mentioned, we've been discussing this here now, the idea of sovereignty and how it is challenged by transnational movements. From your point of view, having studied these movements rather than the states perhaps in focus, let's take, the Gulf, and let's take France. I mean, what is Islamism in these countries from your point of view?
Yes, I mean, it's a very loaded question, specifically because I guess when we look at the Gulf, we see a lot of also very different configuration of what Islamism looks like. And it's interesting that we're talking about sovereignty here, because in certain countries in the Gulf, and I was mentioning Saudi Arabia earlier, a certain understanding of Islamism, Wahhabism in this case, is legitimacy, is sovereignty, is very much linked to what is the ruling family. And also something that we've been discussing that was mentioned before was the fact that very often this Islamist movement that we've been talking about operate within a context in which Islam is the religion of the state. So in here, we really see the conflation of different interpretation and this term meaning different things depending on where we are. So in a context like the Gulf, we see Islamism that is both the backbone of state institution in certain contexts, but at the same time and within the same national context can also be the opposition movements, so we can have different kind of conservative, revolutionary, reformist Islamism being all navigating within the same context. When we look at Europe, and especially when we look at France, I think we need to understand the Islamism again in different ways depending on the different communities that we're talking about. There are established diasporas and there are established trends that saw transnational Islamism coming to Europe. What I think is the main source of preoccupation now is that is associated with the new movements that came to Europe after the 2011 Arab uprisings. Because so many of these Islamist movements became really repressed at home, that meant that they had to seek refuge in places like Turkey, in places like the UK, in places like France and the Netherlands and so on. In here, we see a lot of different new trends actually of what I would define as transnational Islamist activism that are connecting all the new communities and are bringing forth what essentially are new networks. So again, it's really hard to pinpoint exactly what it is that we're talking about here, which I think then feeds into just how easy it is to perpetuate populist discourses, right? Because it's very hard to pin down what the issue is here. And it's much easier to understand something like transnational Islamism as a threat rather than, a new form of diaspora activism, for example. I hope that kind of sets the context a little bit.
Thank you. Mohammed, what's your take on this? Because I mean, as you mentioned yourself, this is in the case of the UAE also part of an official line on the need for and insistence on a freedom of religion and diversity. And at the same time, we are implying, I would imagine, that the state gets to decide who is tolerant enough to be able to be part of this public sphere, correct? And that the Islamists, no matter which version we pick, simply are disqualified because they are inherently believers of their own superiority and therefore cannot cohabitate or coexist with other kinds of Islam, or for that matter, other kinds of religion.
I don't think you've imagined right. Let me, just before I address this, address 2 points that has been made. One, your earlier point about what is right and getting a historical context to, if there is something that looks abnormal now, it used to be the norm and backbone. And you're absolutely right, but that's the movement of history. We didn't have nation states then, but we do have nation states now, and they are the basis of the world order as we know it. Just because it used to happen during the Ottoman Empire or during, the Crusades, that doesn't mean it's right. At least in the current context in which we're living in. So that analogy might not give us a more accurate view of how this is. The second point is what Lucia mentioned on Islamism in Saudi Arabia, and even Islamism in not Islamists in Saudi. You use the word Wahhabism, I would use the word Salafism, which was definitely part of the state. But within that, there has always been a sort of let's say, a spectrum. And on the edges of that spectrum were people who left Saudi Arabia to fight in the name of either Wahhabism or Salafism or Islam outside and kill people outside, which the Saudi state did not accept. So the fact that Islam is the religion of the country, it's a backbone of, you want to call it legitimacy. I would possibly say no. Legitimacy in Saudi Arabia, lies within Al Saud, but Al Saud are defenders of Islam as as a belief. They're not an Islamist in their case, and I think this is the type of definition or the differentiation I was trying to make between Islam and Islamism. The second example is within the UAE. I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood used to be in the UAE, and they operated, and they even they were part of the government. What happened is that after 9/11, after the Arab Spring, they started to go to Egypt and swear allegiance to someone like Mohammed Badia. And in that case, that is where sovereignty was preached. It's not that they're thinking their way. There's a difference between thinking in a certain way, believing that Islam is better, and acting upon it in a way that preaches the laws inside the country. Now, that is the major difference between the two. And when they insisted on having a reference point on policy making inside the country that is outside the country, I think that was where the dividing line. So I think these 2 points would possibly go back to Rosba's question, is that the state does not decide who's tolerant or who's not tolerant. It's the person who decides to act against others that becomes intolerant. And there are, in the UAE, for instance, now, there are Hindu temples. If I am, as a Muslim, believe that Hinduism is not, a sane religion. People worshiping, let's say, cows are not supposed to be in our country. And I start moving against them, lobbying against them, preventing them from doing that, then I'm against the state. That is the act of intolerance that the law, pretty much stands against. The current law in the UAE prevents people from defaming other religions. And that is a policy, that's a legislation. If I go out on a podium and during a Jum'ah prayer and say, all of the Christians should be out of our country because they do not believe in one God, they believe in three gods, then at this point, I'm defaming another religion. And that is the type of lack of respect. And what I've said before is that the policies here are based on values, and the value of respect for others is core when it comes to diversity of nationalities, of beliefs, but I don't think that the state, say the government of the UAE, decide which Islamist is tolerant or which. Believe in Islam, believe in, in Judaism, believe in Christianity, whatever your belief is accepted as long as you don't trespass on others. And I think that is the defining line, Roswell. Hope that addresses your question.
Thank you. Okay, well, let us have a bit of a back and forth. I think the idea of transnationalism is very, very interesting because, as you say, it has been an historical phenomenon and things change. So just because it existed before doesn't mean that it's legitimate today. But you could also argue it from a different point of view. Let's take the environmental movement. Okay, so the environmental movement in the world has people who think using violence to save the environment is legitimate, and those who think that the only way of doing it sustainably is legislation and changing basically the way people live their lives so they use less electricity and drive cars less, etc. It's not a perfect analogy, but you could say that could encompass something like Islamism. Some say we legislate, some say we change people's hearts, some say we are allowed to use violence because the cause is greater. Now, Greenpeace is an organization which is transnational. It's a global organization trying to help the environment. Greenpeace does not subscribe to violence, but it is an organization that in many different ways also has used civil disobedience to try and stop whaling ships, for instance, from killing whales in Japan, etc., etc. Now, that's a transnational movement, if you will, and it's a transnational organization. It's even more organized probably than the Muslim Brotherhood, at least much more openly so. That is still viable. No, it is still legitimate. So the transnational element in and of itself, in my opinion then, would not be sufficient to disqualify the phenomenon or the organization from being able to act. So then you would have to add some other elements that are more about the ideology and so on in order to be able to say that this particular transnational movement is a threat to sovereignty, rather than that their transnationalism in and of itself is a threat. Does that make sense?
You used an example that has no identity aspect to it. But if you used an example like, let's say, Nazis, because that has a supremacist, angle to it, and it was a transnational. I don't think you would, accept it as in the same way you're accepting the Green Movement. I think, as you said, the example might not, or the analogy might not be a perfect fit. But if I would go with this analogy, and I would say that Greenpeace decided to organize, let's say, not only a rally, but put a sit down in the UAE because of the use of SUVs in the UAE. Now, is that a breach of sovereignty or not? Because one, it's not a licensed movement in the UAE. Two, they don't have the right for changing laws in the UAE. And three, that's what they believe, but possibly not what the people in the UAE believe. So that is the breach of sovereignty, if you want to follow the same analogy. But my point with Islamism and any other movement that is based on a superiority of some sort, I think it's possibly closer to Nazism rather than Greenpeace.
I can see your point. I would not go as far as to compare it to Nazism, because I think, again, Islamism is such a broad movement, and I wouldn't necessarily think all of them being supremacists in that sense. But that's something that perhaps we can argue over dinner at some point. Let's get back to the main thread for a moment here. Reem, We've been talking about sovereignty. We've been talking about the law. You mentioned yourself that the problem with Islamoleftism as a concept is that it is very fuzzy, and people tend to project whatever they want on it in a pejorative sense. And therefore, of course, by definition, it would be very difficult to legislate any of this. You also mentioned that it is about identity, in a sense, because it is about French Republican values and what people define, or the state defines that those Republican values are. And the question is then, who shares them? Now, if you could just tell us something, to what extent is this anything that could turn into legislation? And to what extent is this connected very much to the legal definition of laicite? Because that at least has a legal definition.
Not really, and that's the problem. Well, actually, thank you for this comment, because it allows me to start my comment. So what is laicite? The laicite works in mysterious ways. And as a famous French professor of administrative law, Jean Rivero, said, laicite is a word that smells like powder. It's explosive. So what is laicite first? Laicite is this idea that religion, the influence, of religion should be removed from state affairs, and on the other way around, the state should not interfere in religious affairs. To my knowledge, there are two laic countries in the world, the US and France, and I'm going to tell you why. In the US, the system is built in a way that, because of history, because of culture, don't forget that a lot of people left Europe because of religious persecutions to cross the ocean and go to the US, right? And thanks to the theory of the wall of separation, theorized by Roger Williams and later used by Thomas Jefferson, this idea that the people, the believers, religion, should be protected from the potential abuses from the state in matters of religion. In France, it's the other way around. So like you said, indeed, basically in the US, you can be as religious as you want. The state does not interfere. That's the idea. You can be as visible or not as you want. You can have a religion, not a religion. I mean, there is an extent of freedom that is quite wide. In France, it's the other way around. Because of our history with the Roman Catholic Church, especially, the idea was to protect the state from the potential abuses of religion. How so? Funny enough, the notion of laicity started to be born during the Revolution of 1789, but it was not until 1882 with what we call the Great Law on Education, that the idea was really to free schools from the influence of religion. Why schools? Because in France, we consider that school is the place where you are going to make a future citizen. That's where a student will learn how to be a future French man, a future French woman. And for that, you need to remove religion from the curriculum. So the idea was not to be anti-religion. I'm not saying anti-religion sentiment did not exist, because clearly it did, but it was more anti-clerical. So for instance, in 1882, we replaced religious, lectures, like lecture on religion, moral education, that's the term I was looking for, with civic education, right? And fast forward, 1905, a very, very important law passed, which is still implemented today, the law on separation of churches, plural, and the state. And funny enough, fun fact, the law laicite does not appear in the law, but it was strongly inspired by it. And before the law was adopted, two movements kind of fought with each other. Those who wanted to completely get rid of religion because they were really anti-religion and be like, we shall not see religion and it has to disappear from the public sphere, etc. And those who try to find a conciliation and equilibrium between religious freedom and indeed the neutrality of the state. And this is the latest perspective, vision won over. So what does the law said? Essentially that in order to guarantee freedom of conscience, so the right to believe, to not believe, to change religion, to maybe believe one day or not, you need to guarantee and protect the neutrality of the state. So what does it mean? That the state and its civil servants, because civil servants are the state, they work for the state on behalf of the state, must remain neutral. So for example, a civil servant cannot wear a headscarf or a kippah or a turban or whatsoever. However, religious neutrality was never ever meant to apply to private individuals. So the only limit to religious freedom is the protection of public order, which is problematic actually, and I will come back to it really fast. So technically, the law of 1905 in itself is not the problem. It's actually a quite liberal law, a law of conciliation, find a good balance between religious freedom, freedom of conscience, and state neutrality. What happened is, as you certainly know, we have a long history with religion and we have a colonial past. I'm not talking too much about Algeria, but Algeria is really the tipping point, if you want, because, and I'm sorry, I cannot get into details. So what I'm saying is just a way to do a transition with my point. The Muslims did not have, were considered as second class, not even citizen. They were considered, the Code de l'Indigénat was applied to them. They were sub-citizens, but they were not even citizens, they were part of. So the Muslims were seen as someone, as people who could not integrate, who couldn't be part of it. So you had this hierarchy during colonialism, and they didn't have the same right as the others. Does it remind you of something? So fast forward, past decolonization, of course, we had a wave of immigration, people who were not supposed to stay there, but eventually stayed, family reunification. And they had babies who born and raised here, who are not enough French in France and not enough Algerian, Tunisian, Moroccans, Nigeris, whatsoever, back in the countries of their parents. And here come the 90s. And the problem we have with this laicity thing, laicity in itself is not the problem, is what we did with it. Since the 90s, a first wave of laws passed restricting religious freedom. So it's the famous headscarf affairs in public schools. So what we did, I won't get into details unless there are questions, we extended religious neutrality to students in public schools. And of course, the law doesn't say law banning the hijab. It would be deemed discriminatory, but there is an indirect discrimination in the sense that the hijab was targeted. If you look at the debates, the intention of the legislator, and so on. Fast forward 2010, the ban on the full face covering. What was targeted? The full face covering, as in the niqab and the burqa. At that time, less than 2,000 women wore it in France, and it became public enemy #1. And this is when we started to see public order taking over. Because since we cannot pass laws on the ground of laicity, because again, laicity means basically that religious neutrality applies to the state who must guarantee freedom of conscience and religion, we use public order. And there is an evolution in French law about the notion of public order. Initially in law, public order is composed of 3 elements: security, hygiene, and health. Problem is, at some point, we added moral elements into it, and human dignity, and so on and so on. And what did we do? We said the niqab violates human dignity without defining it. Human dignity is not a concept in law. And that's how the law was adopted. Eventually, the European Court of Human Rights upheld it, rejected the ground of human dignity, but said it's a threat to le vivre ensemble, the living together. Problem is, living together, again, is not a legal concept. They open a Pandora box. What does it mean in Europe today to live together? Especially at the time where today we all have to cover our face. So it was never about the full face covering in the first place. It was really about this type of garment which was seen as a sign of extremism, of political Islam, and so on and so on. 2016, the burkini. I've never heard about it until apparently it was a problem, which was rejected by the Council of State. But the Senate recently adopted an amendment on the law of separatism, banning the wearing of burkinis in public swimming pools, because it's also a threat to public order. So the ethicization, adding elements of ethics, of moral into public order to justify passing laws restricting civil liberties on these grounds is actually extremely dangerous. And we have seen it with the law on separatism. Nobody defines separatism. What does it mean? Nobody define really security in that case, because how a woman wearing a burkini can be a threat to security, right? In the law on separatism, the Senate, again, the law has not passed yet. It's still in discussion between both chambers. There are a bunch of amendments prohibiting Muslim women wearing a headscarf to go on school trips, because they want to extend religious neutrality to parents, actually targeting Muslim women. So in the end, what does it mean to live together in Europe? And what are Muslims part of the European fabric? I think they are, but we are trying to tame them. And I think that's problematic. I'm sorry if I've been too long, guys.
No, thank you for a very detailed and exhaustive overview of the legal aspect of it, which is of course interesting because it has to do with the notion of identity, but also the notion, as you say, of what does it mean to live together, and where do you find that common thread that keeps a society together. Now, before we delve into that in various ways, let me just also remind everyone and myself that the audience, please do ask questions. You can put them in the Q&A box or through the Facebook live feed, and we will try to bring them up and answer them in the 15 minutes or so that we have left. I want to discuss this a bit more because, as you mentioned, we are in a sense talking about the polity. We're talking about what is a public sphere and what makes a society tick and its relationship with the state. And this, of course, is about also who is a political subject. That is, who is a political subject who can act and who is the target of politics. They are not always the same. You can, in a sense, be a target of politics without having any say-so in how that policy is enacted or designed. This, of course, is not a French phenomenon. This is not a particular French problem. This is a question of what makes a society keep together, even in a time, whether it's democratic or not, but particularly perhaps when it is a democratic polity, where your vote and your voice is supposed to help shape the policies of the state, and where you're supposed to feel at home, even though you do not necessarily agree with the politics of the state. Now, here, of course, as you mentioned, comes also the notion of identity. And identity is not just a political issue. Identity is also, if you will, an ideological, but also more importantly, perhaps a notion of belonging to a community that is not defined politically primarily, but defined in terms of a common experience or a common ancestry. This is an old problem. If nothing else, we can go back to Ernest Renan when he spoke in 1882 at Sorbonne about what makes the Alsace-Lorraine population part of France rather than Germany, and the whole idea of who belongs and who doesn't. Here, a particular group, it seems, have been delineated or identified as problematic, and that would be the Muslims in Europe. And in other parts of, let's say in the Middle East, the problem is then political Islam in particular, rather than the Muslims, since not a majority, or a majority, but not everyone is a Muslim, nominally at least, in the Middle East. Now, does this play a role in the way that the transnational Islamist movement has developed? Lucia, I'm turning to you again, because as you said, this is partly a question of a diaspora that has existed in France and other countries for a very long time. You can go back more than 100 years. But then you have this new wave, if you will, that has come because of the upheavals in the Middle East, especially during the Arab Spring. To what extent are these transnational movements trying to make the nominal Muslims in Europe political subjects in Europe, or are they primarily thinking of them as part of a transnational movement, thereby ignoring their ability or agency in the local context? Does that make sense?
To a certain degree.
You want me to clarify?
Rephrase the last 10 words.
Sure. So like this, is Islamism, in the ways that you have studied and the waves that it has come with in Europe, has it mobilized the nominal Muslims in Europe to become political subjects and agents in European politics? Or are they primarily attuned to the Middle East?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very old question when it comes to diaspora studies of any kind. And just as we've been saying all day, it's very much context dependent, and it depends on which group you're looking at. There are different cases in different states. I mean, if we look at German politics, for example, you could, or politics in the Netherlands, you could argue that to a certain extent there is an influence of Islamic rather than Islamist politics that have somewhat like bled into state institutions. There is a representation of citizenship that is that has a mark of this kind. But what I think is very interesting is that if we look at what is the new wave of transnational activism that I was talking about earlier, that doesn't appear to be the case at this very moment. What these new communities are trying to do at this point is mostly surviving and regrouping abroad after what has been very often a very traumatic removal from their country of origin. And there are also bigger identity discourses at play. A lot of the new Islamist diasporas, if so we want to call them, are struggling themselves with the concept of Islamism, with the failure of the political project very often in following from the events of the Arab uprisings. So the kind of politics and the kind of transnational activism that we're seeing at this moment emerging, it's one that is mostly aimed towards the country of origins. It's mostly aimed at dismantling authoritarianism, at dismantling counter-revolutionary regimes, rather than being focused on the host societies, if so we want to call them. But as I said, it's very early days. So it could change, but again, it's very context dependent, and I think it will come down to whether all the new diasporas manage to come together or whether they remain two different projects.
Thank you. So we have a couple of questions from the audience, and I want to try and take them on all of them. But so please be brief in your answers. But for instance, what we've been discussing is Islamism, but we're also discussing the political developments in Europe. Is there a dialectic, if you will, between the far-right movements, the nativist movements in Europe and their way of understanding identity, and the way Islamists are trying to proselytize, if you will, in Europe? That is, are young Muslims, if you will, in European countries being driven into the arms of Islamists because of the way politics in Europe has taken a very, very strong rightward turn? Lucia, maybe Reem as well?
Reem, please go ahead.
Okay, I would be extremely brief. I think they feed each other. I think they're perfect for each other. I honestly think at this point, I'm wondering whether or not they're lying, because basically, it's very interesting, because even when you look at the process of radicalization, from the few reports I wrote and conferences I attended, both the far right, the white supremacists and so on, and those Islamist extremists radicalize the same way, pretty much. It's like those underground transnational movements. Often it's like on the dark web or like on some forum, on groups as well. And they played with the same fears. They are hating you. We are the only family you have. We have to defend our identity. So I think actually there are a lot of commonalities between both groups. And that's why I've always been saying, you want to fight the first one, you need to fight the other one as well at the same time, because I think the process is the same. And in the end, the response we are giving are just empowering them, unfortunately, because we are playing the game. Lucia, I think you can give more detail.
So in a sense, not perhaps so much islamo-gauchisme as islamo-droitisme.
Fair point.
Lucia.
No, I have very little to add. I think it goes back to this question of identity and on where you find your communities. And when it comes to like these sort of questions, it's very easy to generalize. So I will not try to do so. But I think it's important to keep in mind that there is always a response to alienation. And very often the response is either the creation of your own community or the joining of something that is already there. So.
Thank you. Mohammed, we have a question regarding the pandemic. To what extent do you think that the pandemic is something that can potentially be used by Islamist transnational movements as a further argument for the delegitimacy of the states in the Middle East? Obviously, we're generalizing now because they have had very different responses and successes in dealing with the pandemic. But has the pandemic had any kind of effect in that regard, as far as you can see?
In my own assessment, the pandemic has gave, possibly a more way for the state to manifest itself. It gave even more legitimacy to the state. We've seen far more state-oriented type of government-led initiatives when it comes to addressing the pandemic. And in places like, let's say, Bahrain, where the political powers of the movements always have got skirmishes with the government, we've seen a lot of solidarity with the government as it responded to COVID-19. So in a sense, I think worldwide, we've seen some sort of a way of looking at the role of the state, because that was not something, political parties per se could I mean, regardless Islamist or not Islamist, but that was not, it was more of a state-oriented response. And I think the most successful ones were the ones that the state could actually move fast and decisively in responding to it.
Thank you. I mean, I think I would agree with you, at least in a general sense, that the pandemic has shown the necessity of a state. But then, of course, it depends on where that state is and how well it has responded, whether people think that particular state configuration works or doesn't.
Just add a couple of points. It's not about how well the state responds. It's about you need a centralized point for response. And that central point is the state. That's where everyone forget their own political orientation. There has been, of course, cases where, and we've seen in the US how that played out, but in most cases, that at least in the GCC, that's how it happened.
Very good, thank you. Just very, very quickly, I know, for instance, Oliver Roy and other researchers have said that we live now in a kind of a post-Islamist time, in a sense, that Islamism as a movement is on the wane because it has not been able to address any of the systemic problems in the region, and therefore is no longer the magnet in the way it used to be. 30 seconds, Lucia, then Reem, if you would like, and Mohammed finally, and then we're going to end our session.
Yes, I mean, I think you know my personal approach to this. I think that something that we need to keep in mind is that Islamism as a phenomenon is always changing and is always evolving. Therefore, Islamism, as we know it today, both in the region and transnationally, it's not what it was like 10 years ago or even during the Arab uprisings. I think we're seeing the value of new actors, the value of new transnational connections becoming more central. And I think there is also our role as, as scholars and as researchers to rethink the categories that we have used for a very long time to study this kind of phenomenon, to take into account all these new variables and all these new actors, and very often how drastically change the social and political context in which this movement operates.
Thank you. Reem, do you have anything to add on this?
Sure, I do agree with Lucia, and I would just add, yes, every political movement, extremists or not, morph. That's history, that's how it works. And I think we need to pay attention to the rise of white supremacism, because I think it will have an impact on how the other side respond as well. And right now we are not paying attention. We are even ignoring and not taking the threat seriously. And I fear that unfortunately, we won't see it coming when it happens, and the rise will happen. So we need to be careful for that.
Thank you. That is also the segue for some of the webinars we will be doing in the fall. So we are definitely going to keep an eye on that. Mohammed, final words?
First of all, I think it's very clever of you to have put, both France and the UAE in this context, but not because of similarity, but of juxtaposition in a way. Because to answer your question, I would think Islamism, for instance, in a place like the UAE might be weaning because of our live and let live type of approach to diversity. And you go into a swimming pool in a hotel and you would find both a bikini and a burkini next to each other with no problems. But on the other side, in Europe, I think that is where it's a problem, because the strong reaction to Islamism, and I think Karim has eloquently put up that the idea of preventing hijab is looked at as an attack on identity, and identity struggles are existential. So it will give them even more strength rather than taking them away. And I totally agree. Not only on looking at white supremacists, look at Black Lives Matters. It's a new movement. It started as a rights movement, but now it's turning into some sort of a supremacist movement. And it's armed, and it can be transnational. And then Asia Lives Matters would come in, and on and on. So we're going into those type of identity struggles, creating bodies for them, politicizing them. And I think we're possibly looking at a more difficult times to come.
Thank you. I mean, we were almost agreeing on so many things, and then,
yes.
Okay, that's for the dinner. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating. I, at least, am wiser now than I was when we started. I hope you all found something here that was of relevance. And I think this is something that we will have to revisit again. And I'm looking forward to having you as guests in Stockholm for that. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Tack.